Hello, good evening. I'm Brett, and I'm your host for this evening. If, like me, you enjoy investigating spine-tingling stories and mysterious cold cases, diving deep into the most chilling unsolved murders, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Sunday Night Mystery. And tonight, we investigate another cold case from the files of Sunday Night Mystery. We also have books to accompany the show outlining all the details of our cases. Just visit Amazon and search Sunday Night Mystery. Bradford Abbas, a village with the charm of an English postcard, sat nestled deep in the rural countryside of Dorset. On the surface, the village seemed a haven of tranquility, the kind of place where time appeared to flow at a slower pace. Its cobbled streets were lined with limestone cottages, ivy creeping up the walls like old secrets. The River Stour meandered peacefully nearby, a lifeline for the people who called this small village home. In every direction, fields stretched for miles, dotted with grazing sheep and rolling hills that seemed to go on forever. To the outside world, Bradford Abbas was a picture of rural bliss. However, as is often the case with small towns, the illusion of serenity concealed the darker currents that flowed just beneath the surface. Here, everyone knew everyone else's business, but only the most intimate secrets remained hidden from the prying eyes of neighbours. In a village this small, no one was truly anonymous. Stanley Blackmore, the taxi driver of the village, was one of those figures who had lived there for decades, as much a part of the landscape as the stone walls that separated the fields. He had arrived in Bradford Abbas in his early 20s, a young man in search of peace after a troubled childhood. Stanley had been born in a neighbouring town, but he had left after the tragic death of his parents in a car accident when he was just 17. That loss had haunted him for the rest of his life, shaping his quiet, solitary nature. He'd inherited his father's taxi company and settled in the village, where he built a life of routine and solitude. Over the years, he'd become a fixture of the town, his face as familiar as the well-worn leather seats of his aging Ford. Despite the village's acceptance of Stanley, there were few who truly knew him. His heart had always remained locked away, his emotions concealed beneath layers of routine. The villagers had always seen Stanley as quiet, a reserved man, someone who kept to himself but would never shy away from lending a hand when needed. His life, though plain, seemed predictable. But the truth, as Stanley knew all too well, was far more complicated. Beneath his rigid exterior lay a man burdened with unspoken guilt. But it was the lingering presence of the past that had left its mark on him. A past he could never escape, no matter how far he tried to bury it. The day Stanley Blackmore disappeared began like any other. It was the 2nd of August 1963, and the morning mist clung to the ground like a veil, obscuring the horizon. Stanley woke early, as he always did. He had spent most of the previous night pacing around his small house, wrestling with restless thoughts. He'd begun to feel the weight of the years more keenly lately. His body was slowing down, his joints creaking, his vision blurring. But more than the physical wear, it was the mental strain that seemed to gnaw at him. A vague sense of unease had settled in his chest, a feeling he couldn't place. Something was wrong. But Stanley, ever the stoic, ignored the feeling. He was no stranger to discomfort. After breakfast, he grabbed his coat, slipped into his old Ford, and headed out to begin work. The roads of Bradford Abbas were quiet in the early hours, save for the occasional pedestrian or cyclist. The village, like its inhabitants, woke slowly. The old taxi was a familiar sight as it hummed down the lanes, its headlights cutting through the fog. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that things began to feel different. Stanley was in the middle of a routine run, driving a local farmer to a neighbouring town, when he noticed a soldier, a young man, barely in his 20s, with dark hair cropped close to his scalp, his uniform pressed and immaculate, stood in stark contrast to the weariness in his eyes. The soldier stood by the side of the road, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though he was waiting for something. Stanley's instincts told him to drive on, but something about the soldier's posture, the slight tremor in his hands, a tension in his shoulders, compelled him to pull over. "You need a ride, son?" Stanley asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The soldier looked at him, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear. Without speaking, the soldier nodded, climbed into the back seat. Stanley instinctively set the meter and began driving. The silence between them was thick, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Stanley tried to strike up a conversation, asking where the soldier was headed, but the man only gave short, curt responses. He seemed distracted, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. Stanley found it unsettling, but said nothing. They drove in silence for a while, the monotonous hum of the engine the only sound between them. But as they neared the outskirts of the village, the soldier's behaviour grew erratic. His eyes darted constantly to the rearview mirror, his foot tapping nervously against the floor of the taxi. Stanley tried to brush it off. "You all right, son?" he asked. The soldier hesitated before answering, "Just get me to Penhill Station. I'll walk the rest of the way." His voice was thick with something, an undercurrent of fear, perhaps, or some unspoken dread. Stanley, ever the obedient driver, nodded and pulled off the main road, heading toward the station. The soldier's behaviour had unsettled him, but he didn't question it. There was something about the way the soldier held himself, so tightly wound, so alert, that made Stanley feel as though they were being watched. As the car pulled up to the station, the soldier spoke again, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Don't let them find you," he said, his eyes meeting Stanley's in the rearview mirror. "And take care of yourself." Before Stanley could respond, the soldier opened the door and hurried off, vanishing into the mist of the station. Stanley sat in silence for a moment, the words still echoing in his mind. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but an uncomfortable sense of dread gnawed at his sides. That night, when Stanley didn't return home, Lillian Blackmore's worry grew into something more primal. Her instinct told her that something was terribly wrong. Stanley's absence wasn't like him. He had always been punctual, always returned home at the end of his day. But tonight, there was nothing. No word, no sign of him, just the empty silence that spread through their house like a thick fog. By morning, Lillian contacted the village constable, who began a search. The police found Stanley's taxi abandoned by the side of the road. Its engine still warm, but no sign of Stanley. No trace of a struggle. His belongings, his wallet, his watch, his keys were all still there, untouched. Yet Stanley was nowhere to be found. The next few days passed in a haze of frantic searching, the village descending into a state of quiet panic. Lillian refused to believe her husband was simply gone. Something had happened. Something had gone wrong. And she wasn't going to sit by and wait for answers to come to her. As the days turned into a week with no word, she began to feel an overwhelming sense of helplessness. It was as though the very air had thickened with uncertainty and fear. On the 8th day of his disappearance, a breakthrough came. A local search party found Stanley's body dumped in a remote ditch outside Yetminster. He was still dressed in his work clothes, his body cold and lifeless. The cause of death was a single stab wound to the chest, precise and clean. The manner in which he'd been discarded, his body lying in the ditch with no signs of a struggle, spoke of a deliberate, calculated act. The police immediately suspected foul play, but there was something strange about the crime. Stanley's wallet, his watch, everything of value had been left untouched. This wasn't the work of a random robber. Whoever had killed Stanley had no interest in money. This was personal. Lillian was devastated, but determined. She began her own investigation. She went through Stanley's belongings, his journals, his receipts, his old photos, trying to find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. It was in the pockets of an old jacket that she found it. A letter, crumpled and yellow with age. The letter was from a man called Alan Crisp. Lillian didn't recognize the name, but the letter was chilling. It spoke of a debt, something Stanley owed, something he'd promised to repay. The letter wasn't explicit, but it hinted at something dark, something Stanley had never spoken of. A promise made during his time at war. A favour owed to a man whose reach extended far beyond the small village of Bradford Abbas. Alan Crisp was no ordinary man. Lillian discovered that he'd been part of a network of men with ties to the war, the kind of men who had made deals with shadowy figures and had seen things that perhaps no one should see. These were men who carried the weight of secrets with them, men who had shaped the post-war world in ways that no one outside their circles could ever understand. Stanley had been a part of this world, had made a promise to Alan Crisp, and now it seemed the time had come to collect. Lillian's heart sank. She realized that Stanley had been killed not because of who he was, but because of what he knew. His life had been a pawn in a much larger game. A game played by men whose names were never spoken in a polite conversation, and in the end, it had been a game Stanley had lost. But the mystery did not end there. In the weeks that followed, Lillian's search took her to dark places, old war records, underground clubs, and shady contacts who whispered of things that shouldn't be named. She learned that Alan Crisp wasn't just some nameless figure from Stanley's past. He was a man with blood on his hands, a man who had ties to powerful figures with both political and criminal. The debt Stanley had owed was not merely a financial one, it was a blood debt, something far more sinister. But Lillian wasn't the only one searching. Unbeknownst to her, a private investigator had been hired by someone who'd been keeping an eye on Stanley for years. The investigator, a man named Robert Hale, had been tracking Alan Crisp's movements for months, trying to uncover the full extent of his dealings. In a twisted revelation, Lillian learned that Stanley's death wasn't just a consequence of his past, it was a message. And the message wasn't meant for Stanley at all. It was meant for someone else entirely. A person still living in the shadows, someone whose life was now in danger. And with that revelation came the final twist. The murder of Stanley Blackmore was just the beginning. The murder of Stanley Blackmore remains one of Dorset's most perplexing cold cases. With little evidence, no apparent motive, and only a few tantalizing leads, investigators have been left chasing shadows for decades. The discovery of Stanley's body, the knife, the mysterious passenger, and the paisley scarf all hint at a deeper mystery, one that may still hold answers if the right piece of the puzzle is uncovered. If you have any information about tonight's or any of the cases that we feature, please contact your local authorities. Stay safe, and until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and keep unraveling the mysteries of our world. Because time, like a merciless predator, marches on, leaving behind shattered dreams and broken promises. Yet, amidst those shadows of despair, glimmers of hope remain. Join us next time as we delve into another chilling mystery that continues to confound investigators and haunt communities. Until then, stay vigilant and never forget those who've been lost to the shadows. Until next week, stay safe. Remember, the truth may be hidden, but as long as we keep the investigation alive, it's never truly lost. I'm Brett, and I'll see you next time on Sunday Night Mystery. But for now, stay curious, stay vigilant, and be sure to guard yourself against the darkness that surrounds us all. I'll see you next week on Sunday Night Mystery. These podcasts are based on real unsolved murder cases. However, some elements have been dramatised or fictionalised for narrative purposes. While every effort has been made to accurately represent the facts, certain events, dialogues and characters have been reconstructed or adapted to enhance in the storytelling. The intent of our podcast is to inform, engage and explore possible scenarios, not to accuse or implicate any individual. Any similarities to real people living or dead outside of the documented historical cases are purely coincidental. The views and interpretations are purely of this podcast and do not reflect those of law enforcement or any official investigative bodies. Listeners should approach the content as a blend of factual research and creative non-fiction. If you have any information related to any of our cases, please contact the relevant authorities.